Line's good.
Never on.
Whoa.
Hard. Hard, please.
Come on, Brent. Line's good. Got real close.
I hear high, right?
Try and hit 2/3.
Have they saved it for her? Yes, they have.
Ooh, welcome to Game of Stones, everybody. I am Sean Graham Scott, not alongside where it is that he is off on a crime spree with Carmen Sandiego, but fortunately, I just got noticed that a warrant is out for his arrest.
The warrant!
So as we wait for that to be resolved, got a great episode for you today. As back in May, Curling Ontario, or Curl On, released the results of an engagement tour that executive director Matt Allen did through the winter into the spring. During this session, he met with 60 different curling clubs, 41 one-on-one meetings, and met with over 300 participants, totaling over 200 hours. So through this process, Matt Allen put together a report on some of the work that needs to be done to improve the curling experience, to improve engagement at the recreational level here in Ontario. Some of the highlights from the report include improvements to website navigation and functionality, improved communication, better transparency and accountability, equitable practices and inclusion. And a few weeks after the engagement report came out, Curl Ontario did release their program towards equity and inclusion in the sport. Other priorities were facility and equipment management, attracting youth and new curlers, and revising and improving business models and membership engagement. And there has been a lot of talk across the sport in the past few years about ways to change the business models, improve engagement, get more people into curling facilities. Do we need to have the business model as, for the most part, is currently set up, where you sign up in the fall for the full season? Is there ways to get it more like bowling, or Matt talks a lot about Topgolf, or ways that we can have people drop in, try out the sport in a different format, different setting from what we currently have? Because anecdotally, it feels like the sport is contracting a little bit. We've seen club closures all across the country, but as Matt talks about, we don't really have great stats on the number of curlers here in Canada, and certainly that is the case here in Ontario. So this report is part of that broader effort to improve engagement and have a better sense of what's going on at the grassroots of curling. Now, the report is 9 pages long, which after all that discussion, you might think, well, that's kind of short. And that is kind of Matt's point. And he'll talk about that on the episode, that he wanted to make sure that everybody had the chance to read it, engage with it. We will link to it down in the show notes if you would like to check it out. A lot of really interesting points in here, and there's nothing in there that is overly prescriptive, but there's a lot in there that gives us stuff to think about, and there are some paths forward to improve engagement at the rec level in Ontario. But I think a lot of the stuff in there applies all across the country and really around the world for anybody who is interested and, like I am, a little bit concerned about the sport at the recreational level. So Matt was very nice enough to give us about 50 minutes of his time. Very much enjoyed that discussion. I appreciated him answering all the questions that I had for him, I think in a very earnest and honest way. So I'm very grateful for that. So I enjoyed this discussion. I hope you will as well. Let's get right into my chat with Matt Allen. All right, and Matt Allen joins us now. Matt, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Really happy to have you here to talk about the engagement tour report that you wrote. Came out in May. Now, before we get into some of the deeper questions about the report itself, a little bit about you, because as you wrote in the preface to the report, you're pretty new at the position that you're in at Curl Ontario. So for anyone who's not familiar with you, who don't know you yet, what's your background in the sport, and how did you get to this position with Curl Ontario?
Oh, great question. This is usually the one I struggle with the most, is talking about myself. I spent the last 13 years in a similar structured organization with the Professional Golfers Association of Canada. I started that role. Ironically, I started it right out of university as an intern in championships and events there, and just kept getting new opportunities, new roles, grew with the organization, had a number of different titles, was in education for a long time, served as the chief innovation officer, chief operating officer for the last 6 years. So that is my professional side. And on the other sports side, outside of my role here with Curling Ontario, is I'm a fast pitch softball enthusiast. So I'm a coach. I coach assistant coach with the U.S. national team. I coach a club team out of New York. I've been an official board member, and we'll talk about that a little bit of how that kind of steered the engagement tour and the rationale for it. So that's kind of me in a nutshell in my sport experience. I've curled out of Guelph curling for the last 5 years now. So I've been a recreational curler on Thursday Night Social League at Guelph for the last number of years before COVID, and then really got into it during COVID, when curling was one of the few sports, along with golf at the time, that was able to provide some safe places to be, and just fell back in love with actually playing the game.
Yeah, it's a great sport. I say to people all the time that it gets you out in the winter, right? Like one of the I play in 2 leagues. One of them is Monday night. Nobody wants to ever do anything Monday night, January. So it gets you out. You're doing something on a night when otherwise nobody's really doing anything. So it's really nice.
Anybody who knows me knows that is exactly me. I tend to hibernate in the winter, so it gives me a reason to get out and get active.
So let's get into the engagement tour, the report that you did. So this is based on sessions that you had with curling clubs. So within the report, you say that from this past December through March, you met with 60 clubs, or at 60 club sessions, 41 one-on-one sessions. Yeah. And so overall, 200 hours of engagement and more than 300 people participating in this engagement tour. So again, before we get into some of the results of it, how did you go about putting this together? How did you find the people who you spoke to, and what was the nature of it? You say one-on-one, like were you traveling around to clubs? How much of it was virtual? The way we're talking now, we're not in the same room, versus going out, seeing the physical clubs and what's going on. So just a little bit of some of the practicalities of putting this together.
Yeah, well, let me take a step back. And it was actually something I pitched during the interview process around this time, actually last year, in July of last year. My interview with the panel was, I said to them, if I were successful in this role, I pitched the concept of wanting to really understand what the curlers and members and member clubs needed from us as an organization. So that was something that I had in my mind before I actually got the offer and got the role. So when I started in September, obviously tried to get my feet underneath me a little bit and understand the role before I started opening myself up to some feedback from our member clubs. But what we did in November of last year was opened a call out for an engagement tour. And originally we were hoping to do it in person. The practicalities of that, given the vastness of this province and how far stretched our member clubs are from Ottawa to Windsor and all the way up north, it just wasn't feasible, both operationally, time and capacity. So we shifted to a virtual capacity and a virtual engagement tour. So we had two kind of pillars to it. Is I wanted to hear from member clubs. So we created a contact list for all of our 175 plus clubs, but also did an outreach through our MailChimp list of 11,000 subscribers on an individual basis. And those individuals could not be affiliated with the club at a board level or a leadership level, but they're a participant in our events, or they're a club curler who engage in some of our programs or services in different ways. So we did two kind of stints to it, is late November, December, and then January through March. And clubs could book individual sessions, club sessions, and then one-on-ones as well. So that's where you get those kind of staggering numbers. That was really neat to see how many people engaged with it.
And how do you try to process that information that's coming in? Because I'm kind of curious on that back end. You go, you meet with people, you sit, you hear what they have to say. I'm sure some of it was positive. I'm sure some of it was negative and things in between. But how do you sort of record what people are saying and try to process it at the back end so that you're making meaningful conclusions?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I wanted to be intentional of was not to be too prescriptive with them. So I gave everybody kind of a one pager of thought provoking questions, I called them. We could touch on them. There were questions that I was challenged with internally and I wanted to get feedback on, but I didn't want to steer them too far down a specific path. So I kept it open ended, had that sent to them in advance, but really wanted to make sure that for one-on-ones, it was a half-hour session. For clubs, it was 90 minutes. And I wanted to make sure they got out of that what they wanted to get out of it. If we had time, I focused on those questions I had. But that's how I really wanted to focus on it and make sure that it was valuable for them as much as it was for me. In terms of recording the notes, what I tried to do was make sure I was listening, but I was constantly jotting notes just on paper because I'm a pen to paper person, and then would transfer those over afterwards. So behind the curtains, if you will, of that engagement tour that was public is actually 55 plus pages of notes and scribbles and different things that wouldn't make sense to the average person who just looked at it blankly without context, but it made sense to me. So that's kind of in an unofficial way how I tried to record those notes and made sure that everybody was represented. And then I put it in the report as well, just to be transparent. What I did then was put all the major themes onto a Post-it note. And I put those Post-it notes on a wall here in my place, because we're all virtual at Curl On as well. And then I themed them. So I wanted to make sure that there was some type of, this is my science background coming out in me, is making sure that there was some commonalities and structure to how I identified those common themes throughout the sessions.
So let's get into some of these takeaways, and it's in the report. And if you check the show notes below, we'll put the report there. You can read it in its entirety, but essentially you have the sections where you have this club sessions, and then you have a list of subtitles of things that come up during these sessions. So website communication, those are two big ones for Scott and I that we've talked about a lot, but you also have demographics, attracting youth, business model, off-season revenue, a lot of things in there. So for you, what are some of the key takeaways? We don't have time to go through all of these, unfortunately, but what are some of the key takeaways for you, or the themes that emerged in the report and listening to everybody?
Well, you know what? When I started them, and even through the first, I'm going to say half dozen sessions I had, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have 150 different topics and themes here, and I'm going to have to make something out of this. And I think with the positive message, one of the positive messages are the themes were consistent across the board. There was a couple here and there that were different from club to club, and they do change. What demographics is or what the business models are from one club to another changes, but they were quite consistent of those themes across the board. And I think, you really can summarize them, and I tried to add my own personal context or reflection or actions we've taken. But I think what is positive for the organization and positive for our clubs and our participants is the list is not 120 different topics and themes. I actually don't know the actual final number of those bulleted headlines that are in there, but it's quite consistent across the board around some of the things that you mentioned around business model, change management, a hunger and a thrive for innovation, support in grant writing and buying packages, that kind of thing. And some of the things really for us internally are near the top around transparency, communication, our website. That's the only one that I ranked. And I think I mentioned that in the report. Is everything else in the report is in no particular order, but number 1A is the website. It was absolutely far and above the biggest point of contention, both on an individual standpoint and clubs, is navigating the Curl On website. And we're working on that over the summer to have something in the fall, we hope.
And is there the possibility, or does it exist, that because clubs are members and are all part of the Curl On, well, certainly in Ontario, obviously not across the whole country, but within Ontario, that every club is a member? How do you try to, in terms of the online presence, is the Curl On website designed to be a central place for curling in Ontario, or is it specific to the organization? And what is the digital relationship, and what is possible with individual clubs across the province?
Well, we think and we hope that Curl On is going to be a leader of something coming out nationally. And, we've collectively across the country identified data and websites as an issue and understanding what our member clubs are and the services that we provide to clubs. So we're working right now. I know one of your questions later is a central registration system. And I think the Curl On website can be and should be, not in competition to NOCA and to the OCC, but can be a collective hub, digital hub for curlers and curling clubs. And that's one of the issues is a lot of our services and value is difficult to navigate, and it's not necessarily protected to member clubs. It's readily accessible to anybody, and that kind of diminishes and waters down the value that's there for member clubs to pay your dues. And when those come out, we get those questions. So that's one of the things that we're really trying to focus on. And we think we have some positive things that we're going to be working on in July and August, and hopefully launch around our AGM in September around really reinventing the digital experience for curling in Ontario.
And that would be great. We would fully support that. I'll tell you, my dream scenario is that every club in the province, at least who's a member, will be through a central system so that you can find everything from like league listings to bond spiels. The way you input scores can be all through the central website, and everyone has their own little section. That's my dream scenario. I can't imagine that's super feasible, given that every club likes having their own little thing. Like everyone likes having control of their own space, right?
Yeah, of course. And I'll tease you a bit of what we're thinking about and what we're trying to design. And it's not a secret because I shared this during the engagement sessions, is what we want to envision is every member club will have their own member club ID. And the club is responsible and has the autonomy to creating access to their club board, to their volunteer base, to their whole membership, quite frankly, if they want to. Those individuals would get their own member access login. We really have to increase what the value is and the connection in the community. And so as an active member club, you, as a club, your board, your leadership, whoever you determine as a club, will have access into a back end. Behind that back end is what we're hoping is areas around club demographics, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is a huge gap that we have right now. We want to create a forum. One of the big issues that is facing a lot of clubs is information sharing and sharing of best practices and creating a community amongst member clubs. So we want to create a forum where you can go on and share a best practice, share a challenge. There's obviously the Business of Curling Facebook page, which is a great resource. But the challenge of that is if you want to go find something that was posted in March or April a few months ago, you're scrolling for 5-10 minutes, right? So it's really difficult to navigate it that way. So we really want to build that back end website and access and try to create that central hub where people will go. And our hope is this will take a few years, but our hope is that member clubs will share more and more with their member curlers.
And that'd be great too. And the other thing too is for me that so many clubs throughout Ontario, throughout the country are volunteer based. Mm-hmm. So anything that the provincial associations can do that would reduce some of the burden on volunteers can be very helpful in keeping people, retaining people, and avoiding potential burnout with the sport, because I've seen it where people volunteer for years and years and years at a high level within the curling club and then don't really like the sport by the end of it, which is kind of problematic. So I like this idea. So I am in on this idea. And that's one thing that, Scott and I have talked about before on the show. So I'm curious, that's something that I think anyone who's been on the Curl On website or the Curling Canada website, or God help you, the World Curling Federation website, would say that, the online presence for curling could certainly improve. Is there anything that surprised you, or anything that you think would surprise readers, anyone who hasn't read the report yet, that, because you've been around the sport, you've played at the rec level, is there anything that really surprised you that came out in the meetings?
You just kind of picked it up there. That was a surprise for me, was how little resources there are for how sophisticated the industry is and the sport is, and the volunteer model is how few clubs have standard operating procedures and templates and policies in place. And there is such a transfer of knowledge as a volunteer board. Many clubs have that, 2-year term, 3-year term, and the president is out, and then the new president has to start from scratch. So that is one of the surprises for me. And again, coming from the golf industry, you've got full-time paid staff on site, and there is a professional standard of having policies and things in place. So I think that's one of the roles, and I picked up on that quite early, I would say. And Jackie, who was the interim ED, we kind of chatted in August and September before I started, and we reinvented a role. Our member services coordinator, Tracy Bradley, who started in October, November, and her sole focus is supporting member clubs. She has a club background in another sport, and really focusing on taking the heavy lifting off the plate of clubs. And that was one of my key messages through the report and through a lot of the conversations is we can't be everything to everybody, but what we can be is the body that takes the heavy lifting off the plate. So if there's a new board or new volunteer base comes into a club, again, that back end to our new website should be the house of all that information. And you shouldn't have to go out and develop your own new policy or know what the standards are on a local sport organization's standpoint, because that is changing a lot as well. And I think curling is missing that a little bit of, although we're not a minor soccer, a minor basketball, a minor hockey organization, we are a local sport organization, and there's expectations and standards on you as a sports sector board that are responsible for you as a leadership team. But it's our responsibility at Curl On to provide that value and provide that resources and education for you.
Well, I'm curious about the seasonality of it, because coming from golf, which is obviously in this country, with maybe the exception of Vancouver Island, a seasonal sport that you have to shut down for a part of the year. Curling typically in most clubs shuts down over the summer. But a main difference is I can go golf twice a year or 3 times a year, which is kind of what I do. It's hard to do that with curling. You can't just sort of go play when you're free. Like, you kind of have to sign up for the season. So how does and we make this comparison all the time. We've done a show comparing golfers to curlers at the professional level. But how do you, as the manager or the executive director of Curl On, how do you assess this from a business model perspective? The two sports that seemingly have the same base of people, like a lot of curlers golf and vice versa, yet it strikes me that the business models are so different. So how comparable are the two, and how do you deal with that seasonality of curling and trying to address, one, getting people in potentially occasionally? Is there space for occasional curlers? And then 2, dealing with the summer months?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the positive things that came out of COVID for the golf industry, there was all kinds of challenges and everything that happened during that time. But one of the positive things that came out as an industry is the transfer to indoors and simulated golf and indoor golf. We don't have that luxury in curling. So the seasonality of golf really shrunk over my 13 years in the industry. It was a big challenge in the early 2010s, especially on the golf professional side, where they were unemployed in the winter and had to find other jobs. That really changed in the last 5 or 6 years with that. I think the opportunity that is here for us, and this is where golf was forced into it with Topgolf. And I'm surprised how many curlers haven't heard of Topgolf, but there is a huge trend. Well, it's not a trend anymore. It's a thing in the States. And I don't know where it's at in coming back to Canada. That was their plan pre-COVID, and then everything got destroyed. But it really changed the way that people experienced golf for the first time. Everybody was afraid of the industry standards and the trends and the intimidation of going to a golf course the first time. What do I wear? Where do I go? That was totally disrupted in Topgolf, where music is blaring, come in your jeans, come in your high heels. There's parties all the time. And when I left the golf industry for the first time ever, so this would be 2022, 23, off course rounds were higher than green grass rounds in golf. So more people were playing simulator golf or top golf than they were playing 9 holes or 18 holes. So the golf industry was kind of forced into this. And I think the opportunity, I mean, we hear it, Bobby Ray has been the voice of this, of changing the way that first touch points are in curling. And I think it's connected to our work on EDI of bringing diverse communities and diverse people into curling, is we have to change what that first touch point is. We have to change the business model. We have to try a few new things. And we housed a virtual town hall with member clubs in February, March. We wanted to trial it, and it was on business models. And there's a lot of really cool things that our clubs are doing on a Friday night or a Sunday morning or something to get people in, especially a younger audience. And again, what we need to do is better support that community of sharing and collaboration from club to club. It's difficult to do that for full transparency right now with our, as we talked about, with our digital footprint that we have. But there's a lot of really cool things that are happening, and we're trying to capitalize on that and really change the culture of how we think of curling. It doesn't have to be sign up for 6 months or 3 months or whatever it is. That's, that demographic is changing a lot. The young professional doesn't like commitment in that type of way. So we have to change the way that we're thinking. And what we're trying to do is, this fall with our annual conference and through virtual platforms and webinars throughout the year, is expose our member clubs and our leaders and decision makers across the province to innovation. That's one of the things that I really heard from a lot of presidents and decision makers is, Matt, we're resistant to change. We know that as an industry, as a demographic, we're resistant. We need you to be the body that exposes us to different trends and different experiences and Topgolf. And what is that? As I said, I was surprised at how many people didn't know what Topgolf was and how that has changed the golf industry. And I'm not suggesting that you can take that model and move it into curling, but it can get our brainwaves thinking in different ways. So we want to be that body that brings in the experts. I'm not going to pretend to be the answer of all problems curling, but what we have the resources to do is to bring in the experts who can expose us to different ways of thinking. And I think that's the role that we need to play a little more effectively moving forward.
Well, to that end, how do you, again, as the executive director of Curlon, assess the health of the sport at the rec level? There's a lot of discussion around the health of the sport, number of clubs. You can look at number of players, but for you, how do you try to assess the health and then put your organization in position to improve the state of the sport, given that is essentially what the mandate is?
I'm sure my board and my staff and people around me day to day are tired of hearing me preach about this, but we don't do it well, if at all. And that's a big gap. I like to make decisions on a data-driven mindset, and we just don't have data. And that's one of the things that we really need to focus on. I mean, the amount of times I have had clubs reach out saying, how many wheelchair curlers are there in the province? How many junior curlers are there in the province? How many women are curling in the province? How many clubs have been filling out Trillium grants and want to know the impact, and clubs that are going through a bid process for a Scotties or a Briar coming up and don't know the data in their own club, let alone within the community. So we really need to fix this and address it. I know there's some resistance from our clubs on sharing data with us, and this is incumbent on me to make sure that I build trust, that I'm not worried about Sean's information on his address, his personal information, but what we want to know is some general data without his name, without his contact information. That would be great. It would help us and help the organization and curling in the province, but we need to be able to answer some basic fundamental questions on the health of curling in Ontario and quite frankly curling in Canada. And again, we're trying to be a leader and voice this at the Curling Canada level, and Nolan and his team are receptive to it. And I know Bobby and I have had many conversations that it's not a strong business case when a sponsor asks you what the impact is. How many curlers are there at the recreational level? What's the touch points I can have in sponsoring at the club level or at the provincial level? And we can't answer it. So again, that registration system and our data collection is hopefully one of the answers to that, but I'm not naive to know that it's going to take time to build that trust with clubs in sharing the data while protecting and maintaining privacy of individuals. That's not what we're focused on, but we need to build the message that the more data we have as an organization can help you at the club level as well.
Well, you mentioned Curling Canada, Nolan Thiessen. What about other provincial and member associations? What's the relationship like there in terms of information sharing and trying to build across the country and share data and get a sense of where the sport is at the grassroots level from coast to coast to coast?
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've been in the sports sector for 15 years now, and I've seen different sports have its challenges with province to province, territory to territory issues and combative relationships with national, and it's not that case. So it's really nice to walk into those rooms, and collaboration is at the forefront. So we have really good relationships across all the MAs in Curling Canada, and I think we're in a really exciting time right now. Selfishly, I think there's some new voices and new perspectives across a few MAs, and obviously Nolan is coming in and wanting to make his footprint, and I think we're in a really good position across the country of collaborating and seeing some common issues and people working together. Obviously, I don't have the historical context of what those relationships were, but I've seen it in other sports, and I think we're in a really, really good spot and great relationships across the country.
And one of the things that comes up in the report is a desire for intermediate level competition. This is something we have talked about a lot on the show, that there has been, just anecdotally, a clear shift away from high level competitive play. The number of teams that go into play downs in Ontario and across the country is significantly down. Rachel Holman winning this year, maybe you'll get more in Ontario, and the new rules potentially with 3 teams automatically getting Brier and Scotty's-Burst. Maybe that'll help with some of the more competitive provinces. We'll see how that plays out. But the report does make this very specific recommendation or very specific reference to intermediate level competition. For you, what does that mean, specifically intermediate? Like what level of competition is that? And how do you think, or how did the people who were talking to you about this, how did they think that would help increase engagement and help with the overall health of the sport?
Yeah, so the intermediate level curler to me is the club curler. I'm the intermediate curler. I'm super competitive by nature. I would love to go outside of my club and compete a little more, but I'm not interested in competing to go to a national championship or anything above that. I don't want to be curling 3 or 4 weekends and traveling across the province. I've done that phase of my life. I want some competition, and I want to connect with my provincial organization. And I think that's what the club curler is. And it's, again, almost similar to the golf industry, where we have an opportunity in curling where we're probably not connecting with 85 to 90% of curlers in the province. They curl at the club. They play in different bonspiels. They play in different competitions, but they don't connect to curl on and play in different competition structure. So again, I don't have all of the historical context. I know there was the Colts and the intermediates and trophies and different divisions. So what we did coming out of that engagement tour is we did a survey. We posted it on a few different platforms. I was shocked by the amount of responses we had. I think over 350, close to 400 responses. Wow. And on a survey, that's quite high. Yeah. And just actually last week, we had our first advisory group meeting on this. So I tasked our team internally with, we have to listen to what people want out of this competition. It can't be, the six of us who live in the office every day deciding what the structure is and the criteria of this is. We have to listen and engage. So within that survey, we had individuals voluntarily offer if they were willing to sit on an advisory group. We randomly selected through a platform 8 individuals to sit on that. They had their first meeting last week, and we're working on right now. Their focus is defining the mid-level curler, because everything afterwards can come around. How is the format? How many competitions? What do playdowns look like? Qualifiers look like? All that can come afterwards. I think the core is we have to define what intermediate mid-level competitor looks like and what their kind of persona is. So that's what we're focusing on. I think, what we want to address, and it's a little outside of our hands, is this was, I think my understanding is really what the club championships was supposed to be designed as, and then it became into almost more of a high performance stream. So we don't have total decision making on the eligibility of that. So we can really focus on an event, and that one leads to a national championship, which we know some individuals aren't interested in that. So we're really focused on listening and making sure that those individuals, and what we've tasked the advisory group to, is go out and solicit some feedback as well. So after that first meeting, they have some tasks and homework, and we'll come back in the next meeting having solicited some feedback from individuals around their community as well.
Yeah, not only does that lead to a national level competition, whoever wins that gets a spot in that points bet. So like it's, and you're seeing that the names that are entering that or have won provinces are people who have played in Briars and Scotties and stuff. So like you're right. Good intentions. And I understand that the rules are what the rules are, but it does seem to be crowding out that intermediate level curler. But it also leads to the question of the elite level as well. You do put on competitions for elite level players to represent Ontario at the national level in various disciplines. So it seems to me, and this is me from afar, that Curling Canada and some of the provincial associations, that their primary focus, at least public facing, is on elite level competition. That they want to make sure that the elite teams are well positioned towards success. And again, from what is available publicly and what I see following the sport from my position here in Ottawa, is that the rec level has been forgotten about or left behind in some regards. So how do you try to find the balance of, obviously you want Ontario to do well when teams go off to national level competitions, but you also have the rec level to deal with. So where is the balance between those two streams, and how do you really kind of manage the various pulls on your time between people who want to focus on elite and people who want to focus on the rec?
It's a really good question. I think we're seeing a shift across a number of MAs. So a few executive directors and colleagues have brought up, they have reflected on this. And again, new voices, new perspectives of, when I look at my business model, my budget, we're focusing 80% of our budget on high performance and competitions and 20% on club development and the base. And we need the Rachel Homans, the Howards, the Danielle Inglis's. We need those. We need to have strong performers. I would suggest if you asked any Olympian, any high performance curler, how they got their start, it's from vibrant clubs. And to do that, we need a stronger base. And I think that's, coming from my background where my focus was on education and not necessarily performance on the golf side and working with the PGA, my focus is on making sure that we have vibrant clubs and a vibrant base across the whole bottom level of, and by bottom, I mean first touch points, club level curlers. We won't have Rachel Homans if that base becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And there's a number of clubs that are out there that are focused on and doing really successful things and are at capacity. They can't take any more curlers. So I think what we need to do, and you're starting to hopefully see a shift in that, is around, as an example, reshifting a rule that's focused on member services and focus on club development. We don't have the capacity to be fully transparent. We don't have the ability to stretch ourselves to the entire province. But what we can do more effectively is making sure that the clubs have the resources, the marketing tools, the programs, the player development, the clinics, all of that information to build a stronger base at their club. And I think those things exist. Well, I know they exist within Curl On, as an example. We just really didn't market them super well. So one of the things that we're trying to focus on right now is we have a number of different initiatives, from Street Curl. We have 4 Street Curl units that are across the province every weekend. So what are clubs doing when you're at Rib Fest this weekend in Ottawa, or you're at a Pride Festival in Toronto, and getting people to experience a form of curling, to, okay, why don't you come to our open house, and why don't you try this trial league? There's no real kind of trajectory and platform or program, an outline of how do you get from a street curl to a full membership, and what are the different activations and programs. So that's what one of the things that the team is working on behind the scenes, is kind of putting an outline on how we can do that. We also have, again, different programs like our clinics program. It's a fantastic program to build the skills at the base curling club curler level, but we haven't marketed it super well. So we're seeing the repeat clubs using those programs, but we're not getting it across the province. So we need to do a better job. And Carrie Lott, who joined us again in November on the communications and brand side, has done a really good job focusing on that. We have the programs and services. We just need to get them visible and the value proposition to them, to clubs, a little more effectively.
Does success at the elite level help with that? Does it help get people into the door, get them engaged, seeing Rachel Homan with the ON on her back, winning the Scotties? Does that help, do you think?
I think so. I mean, that's my personal opinion. You can't be what you can't see, right? And that's a perfect example. Again, I don't want to keep going back to the golf industry, but it was not a coincidence when Brooke Henderson came out and won her first major, that female participation increased dramatically in the country, and now we have so many women on LPGA Tour. That's not a coincidence. So absolutely, elite curlers, and curling has such a privilege of the amount of television time that we have on TSN and Rogers, right? So we need to capitalize on that a little bit. I think we have to build, we being me, has to build better relationships with the Rachels of the world, the Danielles, the Howards, all those teams competing at the highest level, and tap into that, because clubs would love to use them and capitalize on them coming into, imagine if Glenn Howard or Rachel Holman or Sarah Wilkes is coming in and doing a introductory clinic at your club. I would assume that would sell out, and potentially from non-curlers, just to be able to resonate and see somebody that is on TV all winter long. So absolutely, I think the elite curlers can help that base. We have to be a better mediator to developing those relationships with those elite curlers.
And we'll say too that it wasn't on TV, it wasn't on TSN, but you had a really good provincial championship this year. Mm-hmm. Both the men's and the women's were really, really good. Yeah. So you have a lot of players that you can work from. It's not just Holman and Howard. You have a pretty deep base of teams that coming into this season, hopefully get just as good of a provincial this year. But the base there, especially of young players, is pretty good in Ontario. So I think there's a lot to work from.
Yeah, and you know what I loved about that week is the amount of young teams. It was so cool to see so many university college and just out of university college age kids. And again, if we want to become younger, we have to capitalize. and use a lot of sewers, the Jaden Kings, the Kibos. Those are great ambassadors, and they're young and they can resonate with a younger audience, quite frankly, better than I can, better than most of our staff and our other individuals and leaders can, because again, they're a younger demographic, and we want to get younger as a sport.
Well, speaking of which, let's get into demographics, because if you've ever been into a curling club, for the most part, it does skew a little older. I was part of a league. It was a rental league here in Ottawa for a few years that dated all the way back to the Tommy Douglas when he became an MP and moved to Ontario. So the Sask League, people came. It was members of his staff who started the league, and people who had a connection to Saskatchewan played in it. That league died this year. Just the membership was too old to continue. That in the fall it was fine. Then everyone would go to Florida, and there would be 6 people left in the wintertime. So unfortunately, that league had to go, or has gone away now. It made a donation to the club, which was very nice with the funds that were left. But that's sort of an anecdotal story that you hear a little bit more of, that those sorts of rental leagues or leagues that are specific to a club getting older, it's harder to sustain. So what are you seeing from the engagement that you did in terms of the demographics? Is that an accurate depiction that the sport is older? Everyone always wants young people in and getting involved, for sure. It doesn't matter necessarily what the demographics are. You always want younger people coming in. But does the problem have, or does the sport in Ontario have a demographic issue with skewing maybe older than you would like?
I have a hard time thinking any curling club would not say we'd like to get younger. But I think that argument could be made of any recreational activity. Everybody wants the 25 to 40-year-old, right? So I think it's absolutely, we need to focus on a younger audience. And I really do believe to do that, we need to focus on reinventing what first touch points are, or what the business model or membership model is to experience the game. I'm a perfect example, and my partner, who's not a sports enthusiast, joined curling and fell in love with it. But it's a big commitment, and we're in that 25 to 40-year-old range. Now, I'm a sports enthusiast, so I'll do anything and commit to it. That's just in my DNA. But I think there's an opportunity to really build on that and expose the different models that can be achievable and have been successful on a bottom line. Again, I'll use my club as an example at Guelph Curling. On Thursday nights is Social League, and it's so cool in the late draw, you get off the ice, and there's, on any given night, unless it's an exam week or an exam time frame, there's 15 to 20 university kids who are experiencing curling for the first time, because they can drop in, they can experience it. And I'm sure Adam and Misa at the club would be able to expand on what that model looks like. But that's a really cool first experience. And then you start to see those teams. I think this was their second year that they just had it. And then you see them in more bonspiels, and a couple of them have graduated to full league membership. So sometimes you have to look at it potentially as a loss leader of maybe you don't make money on that league or that structure, but there's an opportunity to expose them. And we have to have confidence that people fall in love with the game. And I truly believe that if you have positive experiences and can mitigate that commitment in a young professional's early kind of couple of years in the workforce, or a young family, then it's not right away, but they come back when their family is mature enough that they can leave the kids at home or take a night off and go curl.
Another part of this is, and we've talked about this on the show before, that generally speaking, when I go into a curling club, or certainly I will speak to the Ottawa situation, I can't speak to anything else across the province, but when I walk into a curling club in the city, it doesn't look like the city that I walk around in all day. It has a very different vibe to it. And the Curling Ontario has launched a initiative to expand equity, diversion, and inclusion. So these two things, I think, go hand in hand a little bit. So how do you try to approach this topic in diversifying the sport, making sure that everybody who wants to participate is able to participate and is welcomed into an environment where they feel like they can come and play and be fully a part of the curling community. And how does this initiative, this working group, fit into that broader goal?
Yeah, there's no question we have a diversity issue and an inclusion issue within the sport. And I actually, I mean, it would be hard to argue that there's not many sports out there who are not challenged with the exact same issues. Sport by nature can be exclusionary. It has its systemic barriers, it has its historical barriers. It's up to us now as leaders to understand those and break them down. So it's going to take time to build this, but what we have just come out with is a relaunched EDI strategy for Curl On. We built on what we had, which was very good, but we felt there was a need for us to be a little more intentional and a little more accountable as an organization as to what we were going to do. We felt the initial strategy that we had was a little vague in terms of what the tangible actions are and what we would commit to. So we redesigned that strategy, came out with it earlier this year, and then actually on this Friday, early July, we have a deadline for callouts for applicants to join the working group. So right now it's a board working group. What we had identified was we need to expose ourselves or expand ourselves, to more lived experience, corporate experience on EDI and strategy. So it would be naive for me to sit here as a white, cisgendered, able-bodied man to identify what the barriers. We need to understand what the accessibility issues are, what the barriers of non-curling individuals are. We need to bring in non-curlers into that working group to understand, why don't you curl? What are the issues that you're faced with? So we want to assemble that working group to really dig into what those issues are. The other big thing I think that we need to focus on, and we're making some really positive strides, is internally. We need to be more diverse. We need to be more diverse as a staff. We need to understand and be educated in EDI and accessibility standards and issues. And we need to diversify our leadership team within the board. And the board is incredibly receptive and open to this. And we'll be making some changes around how we identify board members to make sure that diverse opinions are brought into the board. So you have to start with what is behind the curtains and reflect on yourself first and the people who are making decisions. And if you can expand your diversity and your diverse opinions within the leadership and decision makers, then I think you're only setting yourself up for positive change as an organization. So it's a bit of a not intentionally vague response. I don't want to get too far down into it, because I think that would be irresponsible of me. But I'm really focused and excited about the working group that will be assembled and the work that we're going to focus on, and really want to hear from individuals and lived experiences from a curling perspective and outside of curling of what we need to do, as an organization perspective, but also be supporting our clubs with this work as well. When we talk about the engagement tour questions that I had in advance, one of them was on EDI and what you need from us. And by far, most clubs were saying, we don't know where to start. So there's, I think, a trepidation and fear for clubs of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, etc. And I think there's a counter argument: by doing nothing, you're doing the wrong thing. So they're looking for us for guidance and to be that leader of what to do and how to approach it at a club level as well.
Because not only is it the right thing to do to dismantle any barriers that people would face, there's also a business argument to be made too, that to grow the sport, to ensure that the sport is healthy and sustainable, it has to be welcoming to everybody. And in terms of the barriers too, not just the systemic barriers, but I have been physically in a lot of clubs across the country. There's a lot that if you use a wheelchair or have any mobility issue, you can't get onto the ice surface. Yeah. So like there are a lot of issues because a lot of the buildings are old. So there's issues that are being faced across the province and across the country for sure. That a lot of big questions that need to be asked, and that's why you're in that chair to help out the clubs at the local level. Matt, for anybody who wants to keep up to date with what Curl On has got going on, the work that you're doing, and maybe wants to get involved in their local club, what are some of the resources? What's the best place for them to go to figure out the resources and kind of navigate what you got going on?
Well, I think first and foremost this is such a cliche answer, but our social media channels. Carrie Lott has come in and just been a rock star, and hopefully people have seen the change in our social media, in the tone and the energy and the content that is there. So we're using that really as a central hub right now until we have our digital presence on a website front fixed and hopefully launched this fall. That will eventually become the real hub of information and up-to-date resources and news stories that the organization is focused on. But I think over the summer, you're going to see some exciting changes and announcements coming through our social media.
All right. We'll link to those down in the show notes as well. And we'll put, as I said earlier, a link to the engagement tour report. You can check it out. There's a lot in there, but it's 9 pages. So you can actually read it, right? There's a lot of information there, but it's not a tome. This isn't War and Peace or anything.
No, and that was intentional for me, as I wanted to make sure that this was easily digestible. It was not like, oh, okay, I've got to plan a night to read this dissertation. I've done those papers. I made a decision to do a master's during COVID. I've written those papers. I wanted something that was simple to the point. So if you haven't read it, I think there's a lot of value, and hopefully I added some context and background to make it an entertaining read as well.
So yeah, definitely do check that out. And Matt, we really do thank you for your time and joining us today. So Matt Allen, Executive Director of Curl On.
Thanks for having me.
So there you have it, my discussion with Matt Allen. Again, I thank him for his time, and we will link to the engagement report down in the show notes below. And that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. If you have not yet, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcast, likes, rates, comments, all that good stuff. Helps other people find the show, keeps us growing. You can head on over to GameOfThronesPod.com. All of our past episodes are there, plus a link to the merch. We're on the socials at Game of Stones Pod, except for on Facebook, where it's Game of Stones Podcast. And you want to let us know what you want to hear on the show, Game of Stones Podcast at gmail.com. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, still applies. At some point over the summer, we are going to do a mailbag episode. So if you have any questions or things that you want us to address on the show that isn't necessarily a full episode topic, a question here, something that you want us to get into, please do reach out. Let us know. We'll be doing that at some point over the summer. Looking forward to that. Scott should be back. I just assume he'll take a plea deal and really sell out Carmen Sandiego. Hopefully that's the way that turns out. But with that, I will say thank you so much for listening. And as always, keep those brooms on the ice and don't dump that intern.
Make the final.